Hello again. This is another quick response to a video from BretherenLee, this one entitled Slavery and the Bible Mandate. Before I say anything about the specific content of Lee's video, I want to be abundantly clear that the history of slavery in America is probably the darkest chapter in our history. There's no denying that. What was done to millions of people in that period of time was reprehensible and indefensible. It's also important to remember that it was not a nationwide practice and that hundreds of thousands of Americans fought and died in a civil war to end that horrible practice. Today, thankfully, is different. There are still racial issues in the United States. That's obvious. But to dwell on slavery as if it were still in practice today is to ignore incredible progress. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into Lee's video. Right off the bat, he makes a rather significant oversimplification of the economic system in Bible times. And that inaccuracy establishes the premise that he's going to use for much of the rest of his video. But it's just not the truth.
In the Bible time, slavery was the economic system of the time.
Lee just really made a train wreck of a generalization here. If you look at scripture, you can see that slavery was not the primary economic system of the time. Leviticus 19:13 affirms the existence of hired laborers who were owed timely wages. They weren't owned. Deuteronomy 24:14 and 15 talks about hired workers who were economically vulnerable but free. Scripture commands ethical treatment of these people, not ownership. Leviticus 25:39 and 40. Even voluntary servitude due to poverty was to be treated as hired labor, not slavery. Matthew 20, verses 1 to 16 are Jesus' parable of the vineyard workers, and it describes a vineyard owner hiring laborers and agreeing to pay them. These were not slaves, they weren't owned. Lee will go on in his video to make the claim that if you work for somebody, they own you. That's just not true. Genesis 29:15, Laban says to Jacob, "Should you serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Jacob was a hired man, not a slave. The arrangement was contractual. Let's take a look at the next misconception or twisting that Lee puts out in this video. And it's one that he uses in a lot of his videos where he talks about racial issues, slavery, white supremacy, reparations.
There's no sugarcoating what the Americans did to Africans and kidnapping them and bringing them to this country.
And that's the idea that Americans, specifically white Americans, were responsible for going over to Africa, going into the continent, kidnapping blacks and bringing them back to serve as slaves in the United States. That simply is not the case. And Lee's statement there either is deceptive or it displays a significant amount of ignorance of how the slave trade actually worked, despite the fact that that has been explained to him in the context of those other videos where he's made the same claim. Essentially, black chieftains and warlords were kidnapping and capturing other blacks who were then sold to the Arabs who ran the trains, the convoys, the caravans that took the slaves to the western coast of Africa, where they were loaded on ships, not just for the US, but for Europe and for all over the Western Hemisphere. Does that absolve Americans of any guilt for purchasing slaves? No. But I think it's important that if you're going to talk about a subject like this, you're accurate about it, and you base everything on facts and not on emotion and moral outrage. Lee is over 5 minutes into a 9-minute video before he ever really gets around to the point of the video and tells you what it's all about. Let's check it out.
And then when you did that, you brought them in the country. You didn't pay them any wages. Jesus said the workers were their wages. And still to this day, you've not paid those wages, as the Bible endorses the law of inheritance.
There's a bunch to unpack here, and all of it's bad. First of all, did you notice that he keeps talking to you? He keeps saying, you did this? Who exactly is he talking to? Nobody in his audience today ever owned a slave. So what he's doing is projecting that guilt for those people back then in the 1800s onto their white descendants. This is complete projection. It's absolutely unfair. Lee's entire argument hinges on two concepts. And the first one is, frankly, one that he has just cooked up himself and projected into Scripture. And that is generational obligation for debt or sin. Lee's framing implies that unpaid wages from centuries past are still owed by the descendants of slave owners, that sin and guilt are transferred generationally, requiring modern restitution for past offenses. But Scripture tells us that the Son shall not bear the guilt of the Father, and that each will die for his own sin. The Bible affirms our individual moral agency, not inherited debt. Lee's claim isn't just ethically corrosive, it's doctrinally wrong. The second plank on which his platform depends is the misapplication of the law of inheritance. Lee invokes the law of inheritance to justify reparations, but biblical inheritance was very specific. It was tribal, covenantal, and land-based. It was not monetary. It applied to Israel's tribes in Canaan. It was by no means a global or eternal mandate. Leviticus 25, Numbers 27, and Joshua chapters 13 to 21 show that inheritance was about land stewardship, not economic compensation. And a little bit later in the video, Lee's going to cite Zacchaeus as sort of his proof of concept. But Lee's leap from Zacchaeus-style personal restitution to people that Zacchaeus himself had personally cheated to global reparations via the law of inheritance is a complete doctrinal distortion. He's confusing covenantal land allocation with perpetual economic guilt, and it's just not valid. There's no biblical support for anything that he just said. I'm not going to inflict the rest of Lee's comments on you. It's more of the same. You've heard it all before if you've seen any of his other videos about slavery or reparations. He does a lot more of the projection thing, telling his audience that you are responsible for the reparations owed descendants of slaves. And we've already addressed how that just scripturally is not valid at all. He also talks about the evils of racism, and especially slavery based on racism. And I agree with him there. Obviously, both racism and slavery are evil, but they're also not prevalent the way they were then. So I'm not going to spend the time on it. But I do have one question for Lee. If you're such a big fan of reparations, Lee, how would you do it? What's your plan? Who gets paid and why? Who does the paying? Is it only whites? Is it only descendants of slave owners? How much is owed? What should each person get? When does it stop? Does it ever stop? Or do white people just pay black people forever so that you've got people who never were slave owners paying people who were never slaves ad infinitum? Who runs the program? And my final question, forgive me if it's a little bit snarky, but would you be this motivated about all of it if you didn't think you'd get some even though you were never a slave?